Most aquarium mistakes feel like the end of the world when they happen. Algae blooms, overgrowth, messy tanks. But sometimes those so called failures actually end up improving your tank. These are the 5 mistakes I made that unexpectedly made my aquariums better. And I would honestly recommend making some of them in purpose. If you have fast growing stem plants, you're supposed to trim them every 2 weeks. That's the rule, right? Some people stretch it depending on their fertilizing routine. If you are using a lean fertilizer, you probably don't need to trim as often. But 2 weeks is kind of the standard. I followed that for a long time. Every couple of weeks, like clockwork, out came the scissors. I would trim the tops, replant them, toss the bottoms, and keep everything neat. It was just part of the routine. But then I started to slack off, not on purpose. It just kind of happened. Life got a little busy and trimming didn't feel so urgent. At first, I pushed it back a few days, then a week, then a full month went by, and I hadn't touched anything. And you know what? The tank looked incredible. It turned into this wild, lush jungle. The plants weren't messy, they were full of movement. They spilled over each other and curved naturally. Fish and shrimp loved it. It felt like a living ecosystem, not just an aquascape. Ever since then, I've trimmed a lot less. I still do it when things get too crowded, but I wait longer now. I let the plants fill in. Every time I step back and look at it, I'm glad I didn't trim. I'm not saying you should stop trimming forever, but maybe skip it once in a while. Let things grow a little wild. Overfeeding is probably one of the first mistakes every fish keeper makes. And I made it for a long time. It took me a while to get the hang of it. Some days I'll feed twice or dropping a little extra because they look hungry. Sometimes I'll even walk past the tank and think, just a little bit more won't hurt. And yeah, it definitely caused some problems. It did hurt. The filter was working overtime. I had extra waste in the substrate and even some algae problems. But that mistake taught me something I wouldn't have figured out otherwise. I had way too many amano shrimp, and they were doing their job. The tank was algae free, but the way they were going for the food definitely got me thinking. Every time I fed the tank, they swarmed the leftover food like it was the only thing available. They weren't just grabbing scraps, they were fighting for them. It looked a little chaotic, and that's what made me realize that these little guys were hungry. I had too many shrimp for what the tank could naturally support. There just wasn't enough algae in the aquarium for that many amanos, so they were relying on fish food instead. The overfeeding didn't cause the issue, it revealed it. And because of that, I started stocking more intentionally. I adjusted how many shrimp I kept in each tank, and the overall balance got way better. Overfeeding is still a mistake, but it's a mistake that showed me something important. Even when you mess up, there's usually something you can learn. That one realization made my aquariums better in the long run. If you are enjoying the video, remember to like and subscribe. It helps the channel grow, and it helps me to keep making content about this beautiful hobby. I've always had a hard time throwing plants away. Even when I'm trimming, it just feels wrong, like I'm wasting something that could still grow, still be useful. And that mindset led me into one of the strangest mistakes I've made, but also one of the most eye-opening. A while back, I tore down one of my favorite aquascapes. It was an Anubia tank. Nearly 90% of the plants were just Anubias. It looked amazing, and I loved the vibe of it. But eventually, it was time for a change. I broke it down and started rebuilding. And that's when I realized something. I didn't actually need that many Anubias anymore. But throwing them away, absolutely not. So I set up this big 50-gallon container in my backyard just to keep them alive. It had fish, regular water changes, fertilizers, the works. But then it got overtaken by frogs, and I had to break it down again. Still, I couldn't touch the plants though. So I moved them into a container in my garage. No fish, no filtration, no fertilizers. I didn't even do water changes. Just topped off the water every few weeks. And this is in Florida, in the middle of summer. That garage gets brutally hot. I thought for sure the anubias would start melting, but they didn't. They just kept going. Guys, anubias are tough, like really tough. They don't need perfect conditions or constant care. They'll grow in low light, hot weather, unfiltered water, and somehow they'll still look great. Being too attached to plants helped me learn something valuable. Now I know I can recommend anubias to beginners or low maintenance setups with total confidence because I've accidentally tested their limits and they passed. I used to be paranoid about running out of CO2. As soon as the needle on the regulator dipped, I would rush to get a refill. But then something odd happened. I forgot to refill my 10-pound cylinder, and somehow it just kept going. Week after week, still running. Almost a whole year passed before it finally ran out. At first, I thought maybe the gauge was broken. But no, turns out I was just barely using any gas. I had set it at around 2 bubbles per second, running around 10 hours a day on a single 30-gallon tank, with no leaks, a very good diffuser, and a timer cutting it off after lights out. What I learned is this: don't be afraid to stretch it a little. A 10-pound cylinder can last a really long time if your system's efficient. I used to think I needed to refill every few months, but now I wait until the pressure actually drops, not just when the needle twitches. Of course, if you're running multiple tanks or pushing CO2 hard, it's a different story. But if you've got a well-tuned setup, and especially if you're using a good diffuser, you might be surprised how far that one refill can go. So don't stress it too much. Keep an eye on it, for sure, but there's no need to stick to that 4 to 6 month rule if your tank doesn't really need it. Not every mistake turns into a happy accident. This one actually caused me some trouble, and it's something I think a lot of us overlook. I tend to ignore my RO system. It's just there, under the sink, quietly doing its job, until suddenly it snapped. One day, I checked the TDS and noticed it had gone up. Not by a lot, nothing dramatic, just a little spike. And for a while, I brushed it off. The water still looked clean, nothing seemed wrong. But here's what I've learned since. Even a small increase in TDS can mean that something's getting through that shouldn't, like chlorine. And chlorine is a serious problem. It doesn't just stress out your fish, even trace amounts can be lethal. What's worse, if your carbon component isn't doing its job, chlorine can slip past and start eating away at the RO membrane too. Once that membrane is damaged, your entire system gets less effective, and you might not notice it until it's already affecting your tank. So now, anytime my RO water creeps up in TDS even a little, I test for chlorine right away. It's just not worth the risk. Your RO system is supposed to be your safety net, not a wild card. If you haven't looked at it in a while, take this as your reminder, because one day of neglect can undo months of good aquarium care. All of these mistakes taught me important lessons. Many ended up being a good thing. How about you? What are some mistakes that ended up making your aquarium better?